Good stuff. Again, everyone, so grateful to be joining you today. Once again, I am Angela Thorpe, Director of the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission. And we are located in the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources, and we hold as our mission to preserve, promote, and protect North Carolina's African American history, arts, and culture for all people. And so today's talk is us doing just a little bit of that. So again, to go ahead and dive right in. What is Juneteenth? Well, Juneteenth is an annual holiday commemorating the end of slavery in the United States, and it is the oldest commemoration of its kind in the country. On June 19th, 1865, 2,000 Union soldiers arrived to the coastal island community of Galveston, Texas, with news that the Civil War was over and that enslaved Texans were free. This took place 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued on January 1st, 1863. And this also effectively emancipated enslaved people in the furthest reaches of the Confederacy. Now, a formal mechanism by which people were freed on June 19th or Juneteenth was a document or an order called General Order Number 3. Those 2,000 troops issued General Order Number 3 to the citizens of Galveston, and they marched through Galveston reading that order at multiple locations, including Reedy Chapel AME Church, which is pictured here on the right of the screen and still stands today. However, it is important for us to note that liberation and freedom were not instant. I'm going to read a portion of the excerpt to help us to understand why. And ultimately, in addition to communicating that enslaved Texans were free, the order advised freedmen to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. Now, certainly that is not a logical request, that is not practical, and it's not reasonable to ask people who had recently been freed from bondage. And so Black people defied that part of General Order Number 3. In some cases, at the expense of their own lives as whites, and particularly white slaveholders in Galveston retaliated. So already our understanding of what Juneteenth means and how liberation took shape for enslaved people in Texas is complicated. And I'm here today to complicate that even further. Juneteenth, while rich and valuable, is a Texas story. As such, we're going to explore the ways in which liberation and emancipation took shape in North Carolina during the Civil War era. There are an abundance of resources dedicated to Juneteenth should you want to learn more about the commemoration. And furthermore, I'll circle back to Juneteenth towards the end of my presentation to explore how the holiday has traditionally been celebrated in our state. So, for generations, enslaved people in North Carolina sought freedom in a diversity of ways. These individuals used covert and overt resistance to subvert bondage, and in many cases leveraged North Carolina's rich landscape, from forests to waterways and swamps, as well as networks of people, especially free people of color, to claim their freedom. Ultimately, enslaved Blacks in North Carolina did not have to wait for liberation to achieve it. Understanding this will help us to understand North Carolina's Juneteenth story, if you will, or rather how liberation and emancipation took shape in our state, specifically from 1861 through to the early years of Reconstruction. During this period, enslaved Blacks did not secure liberation on a single day, nor from a single announcement. Furthermore, Black people were not instantly or even categorically released from bondage. They themselves sought and claimed liberation by walking, running, marching, or even floating towards it. Liberation in North Carolina was complex. It took place over time and was shaped by the realities of the Civil War. Ultimately, enslaved Black people sought and achieved liberation over a period of years, navigating power, politics, and warfare in the process. To us at the African American Heritage Commission, Juneteenth is about celebrating liberation, the promise of it, the practice of it, and the reality of it. Now, enslaved North Carolinians began to liberate themselves just as soon as the Civil War touches North Carolina, so just as early as the spring of 1861. And the water really becomes a means for Black North Carolinians to claim their freedom earlier in the war and throughout the course of the war. So we're going to explore some examples together of how this took shape. So something that I learned in preparing for this talk is that unlike some other branches of the military, the Navy never systemically barred Black men from serving, though quotas were enforced in the 1840s and racism and discrimination were par for the course for Black sailors. Nevertheless, the Navy provided a path towards freedom for Black men especially, who sought to liberate themselves during the Civil War. Black men, including those who had been enslaved, who presented themselves to U.S. Navy vessels, could enlist and begin to serve almost immediately. In North Carolina, we have several examples of this. And in fact, my colleagues in the Historical Research Office in the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources have documented dozens of formerly enslaved men who took this pathway to freedom between 1861 and 1862 alone. So we're going to take a look at a couple of men who took this pathway. To start, we will take a look at Captain Dempsey Hill. In 1891, Captain Hill was interviewed by the Boston Globe's first Black reporter at his home. And so therefore his experience taking his freedom was documented. Captain Hill was born enslaved in Beaufort, where he worked on the water. And over the course of several months, beginning in 1861, Union forces began capturing parts of North Carolina's coast. And Captain Hill ultimately was aware of this and put a plan in place to liberate himself as a result. He took copies of nautical charts from the local customs house, which he felt would be of use to Union forces, and buried them in a local cemetery. He later fled to freedom in November of 1861. Here is a bit more about Captain Hill's experience, and I am reading from an excerpt from an article written by historian David Siselski about Dempsey Hill. On a pitch black night, Hill and 4 other enslaved watermen returned to the cemetery and retrieved the charts. They then made their way to the waterfront a block south, being careful to avoid rebel patrols. They stayed low and moved quickly down a wharf, commandeered a pilot boat, and set sail. They sailed under the guns of Fort Macon and out the inlet into open sea. As the moon came up, they could see the masts of Union naval vessels, part of the North Atlantic blockading squadron. The 5 Black men steered towards the closest Union ship. As they approached, the ship's guns rolled out and a voice called out and demanded to know who they were, friend or foe. Dempsey Hill and his companions shouted over the dark waves, "We are 5 Africans seeking freedom." When they climbed aboard the US Navy vessel that was awaiting them, they were slaves no more. I should note that those nautical charts that I mentioned earlier that Captain Hill took and buried in that cemetery, well, they were buried in a basket, and that basket had champagne in it. And so Captain Hill and his comrades had a champagne toast before embarking on their journey to freedom. In his interview with the Boston Globe, Hill noted that we told the captain that we were all watermen and we wanted to become sailors and free men. That happened. He served in the Navy aboard various vessels, and after the Civil War, he went north, eventually settling in Massachusetts, where he continued to make a living on the water. Of course, this type of self-liberation is happening throughout the war, and we might consider a story that some of us might be familiar with, that of William B. Gould. Gould was an enslaved plasterer in Wilmington, North Carolina, and in September of 1862, he, along with several other men, procured a small boat and entered it at the edge of Orange Street in Wilmington, what we call today Orange Street Landing. These men took their freedom via the Cape Fear River, sailing nearly 30 nautical miles down the river before reaching the Atlantic, where they were intercepted by the USS Cambridge. In a matter of days, Gould took an oath to join the Navy, where he served for the remainder of the war. He documented his experiences in a journal. To this day, we can still look upon the waterways and the very place where this escape took place. Now, in my final example of this type of maritime liberation, I want to further reinforce that in North Carolina, Black people of all ages took charge of liberating themselves. People did not wait for a single announcement, and it did not require direction. Liberation was also complex, in some cases instinctual rather than organized, and for many, simply terrifying. This reality is documented in a 1936 WPA slave narrative of Alex Huggins that I came across preparing for this talk. Mr. Huggins, who at the time of his WPA interview was living in Wilmington. And in this interview, he describes his experience liberating himself from slavery in New Bern in 1863. At that time, in 1863, he was a 12-year-old boy, and he was very aware of the war. He told his interview that he wanted to give freedom a try, and he thought he had to get away from home to have it. So he convinced two of his peers, other youth, and an adult man to join him. The adult secured a boat and they went out to sea. Mr. Huggins, in his interview, describes his sort of youthful sense of adventure quickly turning to fear. Alex Huggins, this child, was so afraid that he vomited in that boat. They did not know what was going to happen to them. These young boys and their adult companion were picked up by a mail steamer, North Star, where they remained along its journey, and I think it traveled to California. At the time, the North Star was being escorted by a Union Navy vessel, USS Nearest. Mr. Huggins later joined the Navy in 1864 and ultimately the crew of the Nearest, serving as a cabin boy with the special responsibility of waiting on the captain. So he would have been about 13 years old at this point. Nearest was involved in the bombardment of Fort Fisher here in North Carolina. And it's during this battle that a young Mr. Huggins witnessed two of his comrades perish. He recounts other experiences in his narratives and describes discharging at the Brooklyn Navy Yard after 18 months of service. He lived in New York for about 5 years before returning to North Carolina, where he came to Wilmington. And he made a living in the crude drug business and later got married and had a son. And he ultimately supported his mother and some other relatives using his pension that he received from serving in the Navy during the Civil War. Now, let's begin to explore some other ways that warfare, politics, and power created pathways for Black North Carolinians to claim liberation. And once again, like I said at the beginning of my talk, you all are going to find that New Bern is at the center of a lot of this. Now, parts of eastern North Carolina were taken by Union troops over the course of several months, beginning in the summer of 1861. And by the summer of 1862, Union forces controlled much of North Carolina's coast and therefore occupied several cities along the coast, including Washington, New Bern, Elizabeth City, and Plymouth. In response, enslaved people ultimately traveled east towards these Union-occupied territories and therefore to freedom. This is documented in a number of ways, including runaway slave advertisements like the one that we see here. In this ad from July of 1862, and this ad was placed in Wilmington, we learn about two men who are running towards liberation. And one of those men is named Dick. Dick is in his late 30s. And this ad tells us that Dick has taken his freedom before. He has forged free papers in his past. And it's very likely that in this instance of self-liberation, Dick has forged free papers again. Dick is ultimately running to love. He's running towards his wife and children in New Bern, where they too have, as this ad describes, escaped to the enemy. Dick is traveling with a young man, a 21-year-old named Halton. So men, women, and children are running towards and claiming liberation. And in this instance, you have a man who is running to reunite with his wife and children, a man who is running to begin again with his family. Men, women, and children, companions and comrades, groups, many went east to claim liberation and to begin again. It's ultimately around this time, at the top of the time that the war is touching North Carolina, that we see freedmen's colonies crop up specifically in eastern North Carolina. And I'll offer 3 examples of these colonies to you. In the summer of 1861, Fort Hatteras and Fort Clark were taken by Union forces following the Battle of Hatteras Inlet. Word of this victory spread, moving enslaved people on coastal plantations to travel to Hatteras Island to claim liberation. Union troops on the island transformed a Confederate-built building near Fort Hatteras into a barracks for the hundreds of arrivals seeking freedom. The barracks became known as Hotel de Afrique. Here, newly liberated Black people received housing and food in exchange for building fortifications, loading ships, and navigating waterways. This is considered the first safe haven for those claiming liberation in North Carolina. I have to note that conditions here were not ideal. Labor was hard, and as I just described, people were not compensated. Additionally, violence against these Black freedmen, these Black refugees, was not uncommon. At one point, we have documentation that a Black man was murdered by a white Union soldier. Soldiers got drunk and attacked the barracks. I share this example because we have to be careful how we frame and who we center as liberators. It's also important to understand that many whites, including Union soldiers and their allies, did not believe in the equality of Black people. At the hotel, this is not the first instance, again, in this colony of Black people being harassed or attacked by Union soldiers. In this instance, however, again, a Black man was murdered. And so it was documented a bit differently. I don't believe that that soldier bore any consequence for his actions. So the Civil War continued to move northward on the Outer Banks. And in February of 1862, the Battle of Roanoke Island ended with the Union in control of Roanoke Island. At the time of the battle, there were more than 200 enslaved people who had been forced to work at a Confederate camp on the island. And some of them chose to stay on the island while others chose to leave to reunite with family. However, enslaved people from all around Eastern North Carolina traveled to this island to seek freedom and refuge at Roanoke Island's what they called contraband camp. And as an aside, contraband was the term designated to enslaved people who made it to Union lines during the Civil War. Nevertheless, in the spring of 1863, this camp was formally designated as a colony and renamed Roanoke Island Freedmen's Colony. The colony was eventually organized into avenues and cross streets, and plots were assigned to Black settlers. The colonists built homes, schools, churches, a hospital, stores, a sawmill, and other enterprises. And ultimately, it grew and grew. By 1865, the community had grown to nearly 4,000 people. I've offered this map here just to give us a bit of geographic context. These two colonies that I just mentioned existed in places that we might be familiar with today. Again, right along our Outer Banks. Roanoke Island Freedmen's Colony was proximate to present-day Manteo, North Carolina, whereas Hotel de Afrique was proximate or on what we now know as present-day Hatteras Island. As a final example of a Freedmen's Colony, I'm going to talk about a dynamic community right in New Bern. On March 14th, 1862, Union troops broke through the Confederate lines defending New Bern and seized control of the city. Similar to Hatteras and Roanoke Islands, as word spread that Union troops occupied New Bern, large numbers of enslaved people poured into New Bern seeking their freedom as well. In the spring of 1863, about 30 acres of land was used to establish a settlement at the confluence of the Neuse and Trent Rivers, about half a mile south of New Bern. This site was named Trent River Settlement. The settlement was later renamed James City after Horace James, Superintendent of Negro Affairs and agent for the Bureau of Freedmen, Refugees, and Abandoned Lands, a bureau that we might commonly refer to as the Friedmans Bureau. James City, of course, went on to be one of the largest freedmen settlements in the state, and by 1865, nearly 3,000 Black people lived in the settlement. Freed people began to establish hospitals and schools here, as well as churches and banks, including the first African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church in the state and in the South, St. Peter AME Zion Church, founded by Bishop James Walker Hood. And I gotta say, if any of you all in the audience are members or know anybody who is, please drop a little shout of praise or a little symbol in the chat, because it is amazing that that congregation is still steadfast today. I would like to take another look at how liberation played out and explore how people received news specifically of emancipation in North Carolina before exploring how some other people in our state literally physically fought for emancipation. Many of us are familiar with the Emancipation Proclamation, but there's something that came just a little bit before it. On September 22nd, 1862, President Abraham Lincoln signed the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. This proclamation stated that on January 1st, 1863, enslaved people within any state or designated part of a state in rebellion would be freed. We have documentation that shortly thereafter, Black men in Elizabeth City actually began to take up arms after hearing the news of this preliminary proclamation. Of course, on January 1st, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. For our talk, it is important for me to note that the Emancipation Proclamation did not free all enslaved people, just those in Confederate states. Furthermore, some counties, parishes, and cities were exempt from the proclamation. The proclamation also announced the acceptance of Black men into the Army. Ultimately, in North Carolina, the Emancipation Proclamation was enforced in Union-held territories. That enforcement changed over time and as the war advanced. And so it played out differently for different people across our state. Newspaper coverage of Emancipation Proclamation celebrations in North Carolina provide great examples for what I've just described. For example, people in several of the cities that we've talked about today, like Beaufort, Elizabeth City, New Bern, and Plymouth, are having documented emancipation celebrations as early as January 1864. This helps us to understand that people in those areas received news of liberation and began to establish their lives as free people just as soon as the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. Consider this small article that appeared in New Bern newspaper, North Carolina Times, on January 16th, 1864. That same newspaper from just about the same date features this excerpt that I will read for you. The colored people of Plymouth held their first anniversary of their freedmen in the Methodist Church on New Year's Day. Speeches were made, songs were sung, and a happy time was realized. It was truly a feast of the soul to the people whose shackles have been loosed and bid to go free. They will always remember the new year, for it will be the beginning of a new life for them. These examples are very exciting to me because it reinforces that Black North Carolinians began to celebrate emancipation as early as January 1st, 1864, if not even earlier. This is well before Juneteenth. Ultimately, as the war advances through our state, the emancipation is enforced in the territories that the Union Army takes. And word of emancipation is spread in a diversity of ways and over time. So we're going to explore a couple of the ways that emancipation or that people receive news of emancipation in our state. In alignment with what we traditionally hear, specifically around Juneteenth, announcements of emancipation were made in public places to public audiences, including here in North Carolina. Consider an excerpt from this letter from an Elizabeth City woman that was written in January of 1863 to her husband. She notes that a public announcement pronounced enslaved Black people in Elizabeth City free, and that Black men were promptly called to join the Army and ultimately armed. This, of course, would have coincided with the issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation. A series of this woman's letters, including the one in this excerpt, or the one that this excerpt was pulled from, were published in the Raleigh Standard towards the end of January 1863. So as we're beginning to learn, emancipation and its enforcement was not clean, and it took shape in a number of complex ways. And ultimately, the broken infrastructure of North Carolina's counties, towns, and cities during the war hampered news of emancipation spreading. However, it did manage to spread in and through communities despite these challenges. We have a few examples specifically of how whites are reacting to this news. This documentation, though centered on white people, provides a lens to help us understand how Black people were navigating and responding to this news as well. Take, for example, this rich letter written in 1862. In this letter from February of 1862, we have correspondence from a man in Windsor, North Carolina, to an attorney. The man who is writing the letter is aiming to help his cousin determine what to do with the people he enslaves, considering the war on the coast. I like this example in part due to how it describes Black resistance. We learn from this letter that the people that this cousin is enslaving on this plantation are resisting. They are taking furniture out of their cabins and using it how they wish. They are breaking locks to buildings. They are taking valuables from those buildings. They are finding valuables that have been hidden across the property and taking those. They are also very explicit in telling that master of that plantation owner, that they are not going anywhere because ultimately they understand that freedom is near. Again, this particular point helps us to understand that these enslaved people were not only aware of the war, they were aware of their proximity to Union lines and ultimately to freedom. The word had been passed to them. Again, this is a documented example of resistance, a type of resistance that was probably happening all over the state. This example makes me proud and it gives me chills because these are somebody's ancestors. The letter to resistance aims to move the enslaved people inland and away from the war. So he's thinking about repositioning them or taking them to somewhere like Charlotte or even further west. He also notes that he is willing to move these enslaved people at almost any cost. He says that he will take them dead or alive. Again, this is the level of resistance that these ancestors had. I should also note that this type of behavior, moving enslaved people away from the advancing war and therefore away from free territory, is not uncommon in North Carolina. And it definitely takes place after emancipation is announced. Now, one more way that emancipation and word of it is spread is through the press. Of course, during the Civil War in North Carolina, newspapers were few, and as is to be expected, many of them are Confederate leaning. And so what's happening in some cases is that as Union troops take some cities, they also take those cities' printing presses and began to print sort of Union-leaning news in those newspapers. I found a few examples that illustrate this reality in a couple of different ways. Take, for example, these directives that you see on your screen, rules for the government of freed men in North Carolina. These directives appeared on June 13th, 1865 in the Western Democrat, which is a Charlotte newspaper. The war reached central and western North Carolina later than the coast and the east. This notice was originally issued in Raleigh in about May of 1865. So you'll note the delay in this notice that is explaining to people how they are to treat enslaved people and sort of what the new order is going to be. Again, this notice is getting to Charlotte delayed. June 13th, 1865, a date that is not too far away from Juneteenth. I've just placed another account on your screen that describes some of the results of the February 1865 Union occupation of Wilmington. The local printing press in Wilmington now prints a Union newspaper that includes instructions and regulations for, again, how life is to be under Union rule and with enslaved people now being free. We learn specifically from this account that a formerly enslaved Black man is helping to distribute these newspapers as far as Goldsboro and Salisbury. I value this example in large part due to its demonstration that Black people liberated themselves and helped to liberate others. Again, like this gentleman who is helping to spread the word of emancipation by bravely distributing this Union newspaper across the state of North Carolina. Now, as North Carolina cities and towns were met with Union troops and as Friedmans Bureau agents were distributed across the state towards the end of the war, liberation was enforced and achieved in a myriad of ways. Whites also worked to circumvent their new reality as well. I'm calling this out to reinforce the fact that neither emancipation nor liberation were instant, and to reinforce the will that Black people had to liberate themselves, especially under the realities of white resistance to this new order and white violence. Take, for example, this set of correspondence between a Plymouth woman and her husband between 1864 and 1865. And during the time that these letters were written, Union troops would have held the city of Plymouth. In this correspondence, the husband urges his wife to try to get the Negroes to stay with you if you can. In her response, she informs him that she gave two of the people she enslaved, Solomon and Jane, $12 a person in Confederate money to stay. She also states that she doesn't think that they will go to freedom to, she says here, the Yankees, but since Yankees come, they feel freer. Ultimately, this woman is doing exactly what you heard me say. She is bribing the people that she has enslaved to stay enslaved. Her husband in this correspondence continues to urge her to do whatever she can do to prevent Solomon and Jane from taking their freedom. At the end of the war and into the early months of reconstructions, again, Friedmans Bureau agents were distributed across the state of North Carolina to support the many transitions that were required of our state, including formerly enslaved people transitioning to life as freedmen. Some of that work included helping formerly enslaved people claim liberation, often for their family members. In preparing for our time today, I came across several records of people claiming family, which I'll share here. In all of these cases, these freed people are delivering correspondence from a Friedmans Bureau agent, is just about their only form of currency, if you will, to a former slaveholder. Take, for instance, a freedman named David Anderson. Mr. Anderson's mother, Grace, was enslaved by Hilliard Barnhill in Bladen County. While Grace wants to leave, Barnhill has refused to allow her to leave. Mr. Anderson approached Barnhill to retrieve his mother previously, but Barnhill threatened to shoot him. So he's returned to the plantation with a letter from the Friedmans Bureau stating that Barnhill must allow Mr. Anderson to take his mother with him. We also have a young Columbus County woman named Fanny Brown who wishes to go live with her mother. The man who enslaved her, William Baldwin, refuses to let her leave, and he is still having her do forced labor on his plantation. Her brother, Mitchell Morrison, is attempting to retrieve her, again, with one of those letters in hand. We also have a freedman named Sherman Payne, who, again, with a letter in hand, goes to claim his daughter, Mary, from a plantation in Laurinburg, where she is being held. Finally, we have an example of a freedwoman named Anna Spencer, who, with letter in hand, goes to claim her 3 children from a plantation in Laurinburg, where they are being held by a Mr. Thomas Brown. Each of these examples that I just shared with you occurred in the fall of 1865, so well after the Civil War's end and well after Juneteenth. Again, liberation was not instant. It took place over time. A single date, announcement, or notice meant little to many. Liberation was complex, and Black people often had to take charge of claiming it for themselves. So I've offered countless examples of how Black people claimed liberation for themselves during the Civil War era. And again, as we've learned, it takes time. Some people are able to do this earlier than others, particularly as we juxtapose our coastal and eastern communities against those that were inland. And again, this process is not clean and is met with resistance. For example, we see runaway slave advertisements well into the 1860s, as well as the sale of Black people as property well after they should have been emancipated. For example, in Iredell County, several sales of Black people were recorded in 1865. In that same county, in May of 1867, 5 people, Harriet, Dovey, William, Betsy, and Adeline, were given to a white woman to fulfill the terms of a will. In Stanley County, some of the last recorded loans of people who, by all accounts and purposes, should not have been enslaved were recorded in 1866. Still, in Person County, a transaction involving a Black man named Bob was recorded in September of 1869. This is why I challenge you to think beyond a date or an event and to think more broadly about what liberation and freedom mean. People were able to claim their freedom, as we've learned, in a variety of ways. Still others, like Bob, remained bound, not simply out of defiance of whites, but I think out of something much deeper. The data that I just offered you around some of these later transactions comes from the People Not Property project being led by UNCG Libraries. Projects like this, the Runaway Slave Ad Database, historic newspapers, and deep research will help us to continue to learn more about what liberation looked like in North Carolina. The answer will never be finite, but it can certainly be complete. And with that, this is why I also encourage you to celebrate our state's liberation stories, like the story of this gentleman on our side, on this slide, William Headley. I've got to say that William Headley liberated himself. Over a year after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, he was still held in bondage in Raleigh. So he left. He ran for 6 weeks to freedom in, you might have guessed it, New Bern. And he made it in 1864. As I've talked about, it's also important to think critically about who we center when we talk about liberation. As I've demonstrated, in many cases, Black people were liberating themselves. Networks were also a part of this work, as well as groups of Black people. And to offer you a specific example, Black men like the US colored troops. On June 19, 1863, the first company of US colored troops raised in North Carolina, and quite possibly the nation, was organized as the African Brigade. The brigade's first regiment of North Carolina colored volunteers was based at New Bern. Men like Abraham Galloway, William Henry Singleton, and Fernie Bryant recruited Black men to serve in the regiment, as well as train these men and advocated for their rights as soldiers. The units of the African Brigade were later redesignated as the 35th, 36th, and 37th Regiment U.S. Colored Troops and the 14th U.S. Colored Heavy Artillery. 6,000 Black men from North Carolina served in the Civil War as U.S. Colored Troops. Several U.S. Colored Troops regiments saw battle in North Carolina, and some of these men were also responsible for building infrastructure that allowed the Union Army to advance through the state of North Carolina. Still more of these men bore witness to the April 1865 surrender of Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston to Union General William T. Sherman, the last surrender of a major Confederate army during the Civil War. And this surrender took place in Durham. Again, it cannot be lost on us that the U.S. colored troops were liberators. So these are some of the ways that liberation took shape in North Carolina, and it continued to flex and flow and to evolve and grow. For example, North Carolina was the second to last state to approve the 13th Amendment on December 4th, 1865. Again, that amendment ultimately officially prohibited slavery in the United States. Now, what was the cause for North Carolina's delay? State legislators feared that the amendment would give Congress the power to regulate civil rights for Blacks. Nevertheless, the amendment was ratified and ultimately went into effect December 15, 1865. Though the remaining people held in bondage in our state should have been emancipated after this date, we know, including from some of the examples we explored today, that people continued to operate in defiance of this constitutional amendment. However, we must still celebrate because we go on to see people begin again. We go on to see Black people create liberation spaces, communities like Princeville, North Carolina, churches and schools, institutions like Shaw University, newspapers. We see Black people become lawmakers, business owners, artisans, educators, activists. Ultimately, we see Black people work together to create new lives. I hope that this evening I have challenged you to think about Juneteenth more broadly and to understand what freedom, liberation, and emancipation meant in our state. And as promised, I'm going to touch very quickly on how we have commemorated Juneteenth in North Carolina. And with that, I hope that you all have a better understanding of why we celebrate emancipation, especially annually in June. This holiday exists to celebrate the promise, realization, and spirit of freedom. Communities in North Carolina have celebrated Juneteenth for decades, especially since the early to mid 1990s, and they've celebrated in several ways, through health fairs and church services, to festivals, picnics, parades, music events. The list really goes on. Traditionally, Juneteenth celebrations across the country feature red foods as well. Cultural preservationists think there are several reasons why. Red symbolizes resilience. It could also represent the blood that was shed in the name of freedom. Finally, red beverages draw a connection to African culinary traditions and are prepared in the spirit of beverages like kola nut and hibiscus tea. Some of our state's earliest Juneteenth festivals were established in Rocky Mount, Charlotte, Winston-Salem, and Greensboro. The Juneteenth Festival of the Carolinas, which takes place in Charlotte, and the Juneteenth Festival in Winston-Salem that is now run by an organization called Triad Cultural Arts, have some of the longest running tenures in our state. Stagville State Historic Site, as well as New Bern, North Carolina, both have lengthy traditions of celebrating and honoring emancipation, including through Juneteenth events. I am delighted that so many cities, towns, institutions, and groups have deepened their tradition of celebrating Juneteenth in recent years, and especially in the last year, in solidarity with the contemporary movement for Black liberation. And I so look forward to joining you all in New Bern on Saturday for your Juneteenth celebration, or the continuation of your Juneteenth celebration. So we have covered a lot of ground. I have shared a lot of information with you today. Again, this presentation is recorded so you can revisit it as a resource. And there are so many more resources, especially out of the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. If you'd like to learn more about what I've shared, connect to these resources. You can connect to resources like NCpedia, Anger, and the North Carolina Government and Heritage Library. You can also connect further to the Commission. Our Freedom Roads Trail program features many of these stories. You can explore an interactive map to see where some of these activities are taking place. You can explore educational resources related to some of these stories and engage in educator workshops. In fact, we'll be developing one with Sharon Bryant for next year, centered around the U.S. colored troops. Finally, I want to connect you to our collaboration with the National Museum of African American History and Culture, in which we are encouraging all North Carolinians to help us transcribe records from the Friedmans Bureau that are relevant to North Carolina. So the Smithsonian is holding North Carolina Friedmans Bureau records just for our state so that we can transcribe them. If you would like to learn more about these virtual transcription events, you can visit the link that I have included here on this slide. As a final thank you, I want to thank some of my colleagues. This work is not done alone, and there are folks who have been in the vineyard well before me. So I want to thank Michelle Lanier, who is the founding executive director of the African American Heritage Commission and the current director for North Carolina State Historic Sites and Properties. Earl Iams, curator of African American and Agricultural History at the North Carolina Museum of History. I would be remiss if I did not thank folks in New Bern like Sharon Bryant and Bernard George, who really held the torch and been critical to raising up much of this history. Again, I do not do this work alone. If you'd like to reach me, I've placed my email here on the screen. Additionally, you can find the commission online at aahc.nc.gov. We have a lot going on at the commission and we want you to be connected to it. So please visit us online. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and get to a place where I can see your faces and see where we are on time. We're right at 8 o'clock p.m. Good stuff. Sharon, I'll toss it to you.
Okay, if you have any questions for Angela, this is the time to ask your questions. We'll take maybe about 4 questions right now.
Mm-hmm. Any questions? Feel free to unmute yourself or drop questions in the chat. Happy to answer them. I'll also take comments. It would be great to hear from you all. Ramona, I see, did you raise your hand? Crystal, can we get Ramona unmuted, please? Thank you.
Yes, for some reason it's not showing me, so let me find it. There it is.
Good evening, everybody. Hey, Angela, I think you did a great job with explaining the whole scenario around Juneteenth and why we celebrate it. I am curious, though, and I have been for the past 2 years. I moved to Havelock, North Carolina, and I don't know if anyone's familiar with the Harlow community. One of the teachers who was the ROTC teacher when I was in high school, he's from Harlow, and my daughter went to Cadet Head Start in Harlow, and I took a drive one morning around there, and I was so curious as to how this little community of Black folks survived in this corridor of, the beach. Mm-hmm. And recently, Mr. Frazier, his name, he tapped into my conversation. He gave me this short little history about Harlow. He mentioned that the folks who stayed in Harlow had their, like, they were given their freedom. They pretty much purchased their freedom. And I think my journey of understanding at this point is, I wonder how that came about. How were they able to occupy that much land? Because Harlow, give or take the space that it is a significant amount of land on the river. Mm-hmm. And for Black folks to purchase their freedom, I know I'm from a descendant of people who purchased riverfront property in Oriental, and they name it Steintown. Mm-hmm. And my parents lived there, and I know that history, but I always find it so interesting to know. I know about James City, but I'm curious as to wanting to know more about the little folks that stayed back and lived on these rivers, these coastline, and they thrived. He told mm-hmm. me that there was a plethora of just they own their own shops, their restaurants, all that stuff. And I've never been able to find any information, like historical information, regarding the folks that stayed. Yeah. And is there any information out there like that?
Yeah, so there is. I don't know that information on the top of my head, but there are people that I could direct you to, because they are cultural preservationists and historians just like me all across the state, and we all have our different areas of expertise. So I'm a generalist. I have to know a lot about a lot of different things, but right. I could certainly direct you to some folks who would know more about that specific history of your community. So if you don't mind, I'm happy to put my email address in that chat again. If you would send me an email, I can make those connections for you. Perfect. Does that sound good?
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Of course. That was a great question. Thank you. We have any other questions, comments, thoughts? Oh, thanks for what you put in the chat, Carrie. So I see one of the people that we can connect you with is Bernard George around Havelock and Harlow, who's in our audience. Okay. I see another question here. Can you speak on James City? So would you like me to add to what I shared in the presentation, or would you like me to just go back over what I talked about as it being established as a freedmen's colony? Or freedmen's community, if you will. Please add to it. Okay. So again, I understand that James City ultimately grew and grew and thrived. That institution that I mentioned, St. Peter AME Zion Church, is still one of the foremost or anchor institutions in James City. There are a number of people, even who are on this call, who are either deeply connected or remain in James City as well. If we've got any James City experts on this call that want to add to anything that I've shared, I welcome you to. Part of why I appreciate these forums is it's an opportunity for exchange, and it's an opportunity for everybody to learn something new. Sharon, do you have anything to add?
My family is from Harlow too, Ramona. So any question that you need from that, I can find out some stuff for you about the Harlow community. The James City Community Historic Society, they have the slave quarters over there. Unfortunately, we don't have anybody on the line from James City, but if there's any information you need, send us your questions and we'll get those questions answered for you.
Thank you.
So Angela, I see that we don't have any more questions or comments for tonight. I personally want to thank you so much for being our speaker. I hope you have been enlightening a lot of people about the Juneteenth and liberation here in North Carolina. Please join us on Saturday at 10 a.m. for the unveiling of the markers in New Bern on Roundtree and Broad Street, the Juneteenth parade that'll start at 11 o'clock. And after that will be 12 o'clock that activities that will take place in the big field of Craven Terrace. So with that said, tonight, I want to say thank you all and good night. Good night. And again, I look forward to meeting some of you on Saturday. If you see me, come up, talk to me and say hi. Bye.